Who does she think she is? What does she think she's doing? That's the reaction I've been bracing for my entire life. And bracing for it is exactly what taught me to censor myself before anyone else could. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, and welcome back to Self-Awareness Sucks. Before we get into it, I just want to say I'm not a psychologist, a therapist, or a medical professional, and I'm not claiming to be, and I'm not here to give advice or a diagnosis. Everything I share on this podcast is based on my own experiences, thoughts, and observations, so please take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and if you are struggling with anything I mention, please do reach out to a qualified professional or at least someone you trust. So I want to be upfront. This one's maybe just a tad heavier again, and there's a lot in it. And I'm aware that my last few episodes have covered quite a lot of ground. So take it at your own pace and come back to it if you need to. Last episode, I talked about finding language for yourself, about all these frameworks, post-colonial theory, astrology, and everything in between, giving me a mirror, letting me see myself clearly, maybe for the first time. And I ended that episode on a thought I want to pick back up now. Because the same tool that lets you understand yourself can be turned outward, used to manage how you come across. And the line between using language to understand yourself and using language to control how you're perceived is a lot blurrier than I used to think. So that's what this episode is about. When self-awareness becomes self-censorship. And I want to start with how this actually works for me, because it happens so fast it's hard to even catch it in the moment. When a thought forms, sometimes, before it gets anywhere near my mouth, it goes through a kind of editing process. Is this the right word? Is this going to be interpreted the way I mean? Could this even offend someone? Is this cringe? How do I phrase it so it doesn't do any of these things? And it's not like it happens with every single sentence, but when it does happen, it's going through my brain at 1,000,000 miles a minute. It's like there's a whole production process between having a thought and saying it out loud. The thought is the rough draft. By the time it reaches you, it's already been through several rounds of edits. And interestingly, being bilingual actually plays into this, though maybe not in the way you'd expect. So I talked back in episode 9 about how some things just don't translate, how the essence of a word or phrase can get lost moving between languages, and how the same thing can be said two different ways, depending on which one you're using. And I used to think of Russian as the softer option. But that's not quite right, because Russian isn't really a soft language at all, and it can actually be very direct, which is sometimes exactly what I need. A bit like the rip the band-aid off instinct I'll talk about later in this episode. And sometimes it is just easier to say the direct thing in Russian rather than dress it up in English. But Russian also carries a huge amount of emotion in a way that's hard to explain unless you've studied or learned more than one language yourself. And I could go into a whole tangent about the emotional weight of English versus other languages, but that's not for today. Anyway, expressing something emotional in Russian can feel deeper and more meaningful rather than saying the same thing in English, because there's just something about the core of some Russian phrases that feel more weighted, I think is the best way to put it without going into too much detail. And then sometimes it's the opposite. English feels more like the more personal language, and that's maybe because it's the one I actually grew up in and the one that's closest to home. Whereas then Russian becomes more of a secondary outlet and is almost a step removed from the centre of things. But it really just depends on the context. Which language a feeling reaches for seems to shift depending on what's actually happening, who I'm talking to, and what I'm trying to get across. And context has a huge impact on language, identity, and self-awareness, and it's something I want to get into properly later in the series. So what I do know is that the editing I'm about to describe doesn't just happen at the level of word choice. Sometimes it happens at the level of which entire language I reach for. So even before I had any academic knowledge or language for this, I was already doing a version of it instinctively through choosing which words and which language and which version of a sentence to send out into the world. Which meant that by the time I actually learned a proper framework for it at university, it didn't feel like new information so much as finally being handed the manual for something I'd been doing on instinct my whole life. It was being given a mirror. And we studied something at university that's given me a real language for this and that I've never forgotten. And the more I've sat with it since, the more I think it explains almost everything I've talked about across this season so far. It's a theory by a sociologist called Goffman, and the idea is roughly this. We all have a backstage self and a front stage self. Backstage is who you are when no one's watching. No performance required. Front stage is the version of you that exists for an audience, shaped by who's looking and what you think they expect. Goffman, of course, wasn't writing about social media or podcasts because he was writing decades before any of that existed, but the framework holds up almost unsettlingly well once you start applying it to yourself. And I think this actually connects directly to the shadow work I talked about a couple of episodes ago. Because the shadow, in Jung's sense, is the parts of yourself you push down because they don't fit the version you want to present. And Goffman is essentially describing the mechanism for how that happens, moment to moment, in real time. The shadow is what gets left backstage. The front stage performance is what's left once you've edited the shadow out. And the unsettling part is realising how much of what I thought was just who I am is actually front stage, performed, even if I'm the only one who notices the performance. And the more self-aware I've become, the more I can feel that line between the two selves in real time while it's happening. Which sounds like it should be a good thing, and mostly it is, but it also means I can't unsee the editing anymore. I know exactly when I'm doing it. And I actually have a name for my backstage self. Not literally, but I know exactly who she is. The version of myself that exists only in my head is a performer. She gets up and sings her heart out, and she's quite good. And she dances without thinking about who's watching. And she's confident and maybe even a little cocky and maybe even good at flirting and always knows exactly what to say. She has the answer to everything. Which is ironic given how much time I spend editing what actually comes out of my mouth. And I'm aware this isn't a completely unfamiliar idea. Plenty of performers talk about something similar. There's Beyonce, who's spoken about stepping into Sasha Fierce to access a more confident, uninhibited version of herself on stage. And I think Tate McRae has talked about Tatiana, if I remember that correctly, in the same way. A version of yourself you step into specifically to do the bold thing. The thing the everyday version of you wouldn't quite let yourself do. An alternate personality, basically. And I think that's a slightly different use of front stage and backstage than the one I've been describing. It's more deliberate and more chosen, and almost a tool rather than a trap. And it's something I want to come back to properly in a future episode about confidence, because I think there's a real difference between consciously stepping into an alter ego to access a part of yourself and what I've been describing, which is a version of you that just stays locked away because you've never given them permission to exist at all. And my performer isn't hidden because there's anything wrong with her. She's hidden because somewhere along the way I stopped feeling safe enough to bring her out. And funnily enough, growing up, people used to tell me I'd make a good actress and that I have good camera presence. But I could never bring myself to pursue it because I was too scared of how I'd come across and too shaped by the years of bullying to ever really try. So that performer just stayed where she was in my head. Okay, I know, I bring up school and the bullying a lot on this podcast, I'm aware. And I'll try not to keep going back to the well so often. But honestly, whenever I actually sit down and trace where a pattern started, the road keeps leading back to the same handful of years. Because they were genuinely pivotal in a way I don't think I understood at the time. Which, again, connects to Goffman, since I'm clearly getting my money's worth out of that one university module. He didn't just write about front stage and backstage selves. He also wrote about something called stigma, and specifically stigma management, which is essentially the strategies people use to control information about themselves so they aren't discredited by the people around them. When my bully eventually told me, all those years later, that I was just an easy target, what he'd actually handed me, even if neither of us would have put it this way at the time, was a label, a stigma. And everything I'd unknowingly done since then, which I'll talk about a bit more shortly, but hiding the books I've written and softening my laugh, talking myself out of comments online, was a form of managing that label. Trying to control what people could see, so the stigma never got confirmed again. And I think I've finally landed on the actual sentence underneath all of this. The one I've never said out loud before, not even to myself properly until right now. And it's this. Who does she think she is? What does she think she's doing? That's the imagined reaction I've been bracing for this whole time. Every time the performer tries to get anywhere near a stage. Not even outright cruelty, just that specific flavour of judgment. You know, the raised eyebrow, the implied audacity of taking up space, of being confident, of doing the bold thing without first earning permission for it. And I think it might be one of the biggest shadows I'm carrying, and definitely one of the longest running. And it's shaped how I used to and how I still post online, how I show up in groups, and how loudly I let myself want things. And the uncomfortable part is realising that episodes 4 and 5 were both already handing me the way out of this. Free will is reason enough, and to be cringe is to be free. And I still didn't fully take it. Because knowing intellectually that you're allowed to do something isn't the same as believing it deep down. But there's a word for the thing on the other side of that belief, though, and it is audacity. Just having the audacity to do the thing anyway, before you feel ready, before you've built a case for why you're allowed. And that might be the actual antidote to all of this. Not necessarily more self-awareness, just audacity. But as always, as long as it's not hurting anyone else. So yes, a lot of what I talk about comes from a small handful of backstories, told from different angles and different episodes. I know that. But I've sat with these moments for years, and over time I've started to see the roots underneath them, how one thing grew out of another. And it's a kind of ongoing self-psychoanalysis, if that's a fair way to put it. So when I keep circling back to the same handful of memories, it's not because nothing else has happened to me. It's because these are the seeds. Almost everything else I've talked about across this season has grown out of them in one way or another. So to understand why the performer stayed there for so long, I do have to take us back to those years at school for a second, because I don't think I fully explained where that fear actually came from. And I want to make sure that when I describe things, they are explicit and clear, because it's me trying to translate my thoughts and observations in a way that may be recognisable or relatable for you as the listener. So, of course, I've talked a lot about my bullying and about feeling like a dot outside the circle. And there's the layer I mentioned before, which is that I didn't feel like I fit anywhere, even within the world of not fitting in, about being an outcast from the outcasts. And I've talked about this before as well, but there's so many things I could say about this particular concept. If you think about every movie set in a school you've ever watched, there's usually a cast of recognisable groups. The popular kids, the jocks, the theatre kids, I don't know, the alternative kids, that could be an umbrella term for so many, goths, emos, all sorts. And of course, the nerds with the glasses and the braces who get the makeover in the third act. And even though this is a little bit sad and cringe to say out loud, I always expected my own experience to map onto that, because that was the only data I had as a kid. I assumed that that's what school was supposed to look like. But as I've said before, I didn't feel like I fit into any of it. I wasn't popular, but I also wasn't really one of these outcasts either. And I wasn't one of the kids known for academia, even though I was fairly academic and, a bit of a nerdy kid myself. One thing I do know, that I was a fangirl in a way that came with its own very specific stereotype at the time, mostly thanks to a certain corner of the internet. And I'm not even sure if a lot of my classmates were aware of this stereotype, or at least not in a way that I noticed, but there was this assumption that fangirls were a bit strange, and maybe even still are. I'm pretty sure this still is the assumption, and that fangirls are obsessive and not really someone you'd want to get close to. And that wasn't true for myself or my friends, because we still fit into the social sphere of our year group, but the stereotype existed anyway. And because I identified with it, because I did feel very passionately about things, and I still do, I absorbed that stereotype before I'd even properly examined whether everything that came with it truly applied and whether it was even an accurate description. But looking back, that fangirl thing connects directly to episode 5 and how being cringe is giving yourself freedom. Because being a fangirl properly, unashamedly, loudly excited about something is about as cringe as it gets by most people's standards. And I think that's exactly why the performer in my head exists. She's the version of me that never got the memo that loving something openly was supposed to be embarrassing. She's cringe in the best possible sense, completely free of the self-consciousness that I've never quite managed to shake off in real life. So in a strange way, this whole episode is about the gap between knowing intellectually that cringe is freedom and actually being able to live like it's true. And in school, every single summer, I would tell myself, this is the year, that I'd have some kind of transformation and I'd walk back into school in September and there'd be this really dramatic moment where, you know, people's jaws would hit the floor. You know that scene where the person moves in slow-mo after a transformation? That's what I'd always had in my head, and people would go, oh my God, is that Lisa? Oh my God, she's changed so much. And all those cliche phrases. But it never happened, obviously, because it was never going to happen. Not in the way that was in my head or the way that media portrayed it. Because the thing I actually needed to change wasn't how I looked. It was internal. It was the narrative in my head. But I just didn't know that yet. So by the time I got to university, I was carrying all of that. The dot outside the circle, the bully's voice, the summer transformations that never came, and a performer in my head who I'd never let out because the version of me that did exist out loud had already been told repeatedly in different ways that she just wasn't quite right. And I want to pause for a sec here because I don't want this to sound like I'm saying you should wait for some big transformation or that you need to change in order to be accepted. I talked about this back in episode 3. You know, yes, there is no one coming to do it for you and no one is going to make the changes you want for yourself. But you don't have to chase some imaginary September reveal to be allowed to just exist as yourself. I just didn't understand that at the time. What I actually needed wasn't a new look. It was language. It was understanding. I needed the words for what was actually going on so I could stop waiting for an external moment to fix something that was never really about how I looked in the first place. Not that it was ever something that needed fixing. And again, that goes back to episode 4 about how free will is reason enough. Wanting to do something, wanting to be a certain way, doesn't need to be justified by anyone else's approval first. But back then, I hadn't internalized that yet. I was still operating as if I needed permission or proof or some external green light before I was allowed to just be the version of myself I actually wanted to be. The performer didn't need anyone's permission to exist. She just needed mine. And I hadn't given it yet. And that's the connection I want to draw out properly because it's easy to miss. This entire chapter of feeling like I didn't fit, hoping for some transformation, never quite getting there, all of that happened years before I had any of the language I talked about last episode. There was no post-colonial theory yet, no astrology, no Goffman, no Jung, just a kid trying to work out why she felt off to one side with absolutely no framework to make sense of it. So when I eventually did start getting language for things, the censoring habit was already fully formed. The editing process I described earlier checking every word before it leaves my mouth, that didn't start because I became self-aware. It started long before that as a kind of armour. Self-awareness just made me conscious of the armour. It didn't put it there. And this came to a head properly at university. Because by the time I got to uni, I thought, this is it. Nobody here knows me. This is my chance to be the version I actually want to be. Which I think I've mentioned previously as well. And again, looking back, I was definitely going through a bit of an identity crisis in those first few years. Or throughout the entirety of university, actually, which I'm pretty sure, people do warn you about. You just never take seriously at 18. But at the time, I had no idea that's what it was. I just thought, this is who I am. I'm an overthinker, and my brain just works like this. And one of my friends actually got me a mug that said Overthinkers Anonymous on it. Which, is still kind of true, because otherwise we wouldn't have these very lengthy podcast episodes, because it all requires a lot of thinking and overthinking to put these together, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. But I didn't have the distance yet to see it as a pattern with a cause. It just felt like personality. And it's taken years before I could look back and go, oh, that wasn't just how my brain worked. That was a loop I was stuck in, and I didn't even know I was in it. And part of that loop was the confirmation bias that I've discussed before. But I didn't know that word at the time either. I was always so braced for people to find me annoying or too much or strange that I'd notice anything that even slightly confirmed it and file it away as proof. Which meant the strange thing is, instead of finally letting that version out, I hid even more. I doubled down. I wanted to come across as cool, but also intelligent, also attractive, and also desirable, both romantically and platonically. And underneath all of that was the same amalgamation I've talked about before. The comments, the bullying of being fat and ugly and weird and annoying and boring, and the version of me other people had built and that I'd absorbed as fact. And the maddening thing was, I couldn't actually change that perception because my whole sense of self was rooted in it. You can't outperform a belief that's load-bearing. I wanted more than anything to be the person whose house or apartment everyone wanted to be in. Not even necessarily popular in some big dramatic way, just wanted, sought after, the host rather than the guest. But as I've said before, I never facilitated those experiences. I waited for them to just happen, to be desirable enough that people would naturally gravitate towards me, that it would all just fall into my lap. And then when it didn't, I would get disappointed, and that feedback loop, that confirmation bias, would run the tape again of all the evidence, the data, that proved I was the person I was, but didn't actually want to be. And one of the things I hid the hardest, until recently, are the books I've written. It's fan fiction, but calling it that, in my opinion, undersells it a little bit. It's now a duology. The first one is just under 90,000 words, and the second is 193,000 words, with 49 chapters, a prologue, and an epilogue. It took me 6 years to write it. I built an entire world inside that duology, and I loved doing it. But because it was fan fiction, because of exactly the stereotype I mentioned a moment ago, I felt embarrassed about it in a way that didn't match how much I actually loved writing it. So I've kept it quiet. I let people know I like to write in a kind of vague, acceptable way. But the real thing, the thing I'd poured myself into for years, stayed backstage. Which, at uni, was quite hard to do in a degree where half the modules were all about creative writing. But that's the bit that gets me, looking back. I wasn't hiding something I was ashamed of in any real sense. I was hiding something I loved because I'd absorbed a story about what it meant about me if people knew. I know I've brought up a few theories, and it's just because I find them really fascinating, and of course they do relate to self-awareness and the things that I've discussed, so just a heads up, I'll probably keep bringing them up. And saying that, there's one that I want to talk about now, and it's that there's a concept in developmental psychology called identity foreclosure, which describes committing to an identity, or in this case, hiding a part of one, without ever properly exploring whether the fear behind it was even justified. I didn't test whether people would actually judge me for the books. I just assumed they would, based on a stereotype I'd absorbed secondhand, and foreclosed the whole question before it could even be asked. Which meant the version of me that existed publicly was built on an assumption I'd never actually checked. So the anonymity of a fresh start didn't free me the way I expected it to. It raised the stakes, because now every single thing I said or did felt like it was building a first impression I couldn't take back. So instead of letting the performer out, I overcorrected into someone smaller and more careful than I'd ever been. And I remember one specific moment, walking on campus with my best friend, trying to explain this to her. And I said something like, sometimes I don't say what I actually mean. I filter it on the way from my brain to my mouth. And she asked what I meant, and at the time I just went, oh, no, don't worry about it. Which, if you think about it, is exactly the thing I was trying to describe happening in real time. I self-censored the explanation of my self-censorship. But it also wasn't the first time this pattern had shown up. Again, even if I didn't have the language for it yet. I've talked about the small and white lies that I used to tell, the topic of episode 2, how, softening the truth and adjusting a story slightly so it landed better, just so that I could come across better. And at the time I thought of that as a separate habit. But upon reflection, I think it was the same editing process, just with the stakes turned down. If self-censorship is deciding not to say the true thing at all, white lies were the version where I said something, just not quite the true thing. Different outputs, same engine underneath. And here's where it stops being just a uni story and becomes something bigger. Not long ago, I was watching something online and I had a comment forming. I knew almost instantly that it could go down badly with a particular group of people. Now, I could discuss what I'm about to say at length, so I might come back to it at some point. And here's a bit of me self-editing in real time. But what I'm about to say is very base level. It's very foundational, and like I say, I could talk about it for a very long time. So we're in an era where one half of the conversation says you can't say anything anymore without offending someone, and the other half says we should be mindful of language because words carry real weight. And I think that both of those things are true at once, which makes it complicated. And I know that's a very broad statement to make, and like I say, I could discuss it in a lot of detail, but I'm just going to park it there for the purpose of this discussion. So when I had that comment forming and I knew that it could upset a certain demographic, it wasn't actually that stopped me. What stopped me was running a simulation in my head. Before I'd even finished forming the thought, I was already 3 steps ahead, imagining every way it could be misread, who might respond, what I'd have to clarify, whether I'd have to write a follow-up explaining what I actually meant. And somewhere in that simulation, I decided it just wasn't worth it. Not because I didn't believe what I thought, because the cost of being precise enough to avoid every possible misreading felt higher than the value of just saying it. So I didn't post the comment. And I remember thinking almost immediately, oh my God, self-awareness sucks. Because this is what it does. It doesn't just help you understand yourself, it can talk you out of speaking entirely. And there's a bigger version of this fear underneath a small one. Because on top of this era of one half getting upset about not being able to say the things they want to say, and the other half telling them that, well, no, you need to be more mindful of language, we're also in an era where almost everyone has some kind of digital footprint. And over the years, we've all watched old posts resurface and become genuinely catastrophic for someone, sometimes years later, often stripped of whatever context they were originally said in. You know, we've seen it happen to celebrities constantly. People who said something years ago, before there was much shared understanding of what was appropriate or who was paying attention, and it gets brought back up and judged entirely on today's standards rather than the moment it was actually said in. Now, of course, this most of the time is a good thing that is brought back up, but that's just the example that I wanted to give, because there is kind of a double standard buried in that too. We hold public figures to an incredibly high bar, partly because we've decided that they have a responsibility to be role models, and partly, I think, because it's easier to scrutinise someone we don't actually know. We rarely extend that same scrutiny or that same grace to the people physically next to us. At least in my experience. I could be wrong. But the awareness that anything you might say now or have said, and how it might resurface later, stripped of context, has impacted how careful I am. And it's part of why doing this podcast feels daunting sometimes. Not because I'm saying anything wrong, but because I know context can be stripped away, twisted, or just lost entirely over time. And that's why I want to talk about context in an episode on its own, because there's so many layers and branches of it that can impact how something is interpreted, that just briefly mentioning it in this one episode won't do it justice. And it's not daunting because I feel like I'm saying anything wrong. It's more because I know that context can be stripped away and twisted or just lost entirely over time. And once you're aware that that's possible, it's hard to unknow it. Which then loops straight back to the running simulation I've just described, except now the simulation doesn't just run for the next 5 minutes, it runs for years. But it's not just speaking. It can talk you out of being yourself. It can paralyze you into a version of you that isn't true, which is exactly what happened at uni. The performer in my head never got a stage. Instead, I built a smaller, safer, edited version and called that the real me, because at least she couldn't be misread. And there's another layer to this worth admitting. Most of the time, when I do say the unedited thing, I say it to people I already feel safe with. which sounds sensible, except it completely skews the experiment. If I'm only testing my honesty on people who are unlikely to judge me for it, of course it tends to go fine. That's not really evidence that the unedited version is safe. It's just evidence that I've chosen my test subjects carefully. And another version of this shows up in how I navigate hard conversations that I talked about with in Confronting the Shadow Self, about how I've taught myself to pause during hard conversations. And if I'm going to get specific with this, there is someone in my life that I have a lot of debates with, someone I love, who can be harder to reach depending on the day. And before I say something that might be interpreted wrong, I find myself doing a quick read. What mood are they in? Is today a good day for this conversation or not? Is this worth the energy it's going to take? That instinct to read the room before speaking isn't unique to me, I don't think. I think that there's a lot of people who have someone in their life similar to that. But it's another version of the same editing process. Calculating the cost of honesty before deciding whether to pay it. This one's just a little bit different though, because it's simultaneously a safe and unsafe test subject. It's someone who pushes back, but I know there won't be any fallout. But if I'm going to be honest, it's probably a better practice with pushback than all the safe conversations put together. And sometimes after all the calculating before I say whatever it is I want to say, I just go, oh, do you know what, screw it, I'm just going to rip the band-aid off and say the thing. And then it goes fine. More often than the anxious simulation in my head predicted it would. And there is another reason I hold back in debates and arguments specifically, separate from worrying about hurting someone. It's just that I hate not knowing things, and I don't like being wrong, and I really don't like being proven wrong. So if I'm not fully confident in what I'm arguing, I'd rather stay quiet than wade in on assumptions and risk getting pulled somewhere I can't defend. That's not really about protecting the other person. That one's about protecting myself. And I think it's a thread that I'll come back to properly again much later, because I don't think I've fully unpacked it yet, even to myself. And again, there is a name for this, another psychological theory that I found whilst thinking through this episode, and it's called need for cognitive closure, which is a concept from social psychology describing how some people have a much stronger drive than others to reach a definite, settled answer and a much lower tolerance for ambiguity or being caught mid-out. People high in it tend to commit to positions quickly just to escape the discomfort of not knowing, or, in my case, go the other way entirely and just stay quiet rather than risk being visibly unsure. And having the actual term for it doesn't fix it, but at least now when it shows up, I recognise it for what it is, rather than just experiencing it as a vague reluctance to speak. There is a difference, though, between that kind of editing and a technique I talked about back in Confronting the Shadow Self, which, you know, that whole section and what I've just talked about with debates, and it's learning to pause in moments of conflict to actually sit with what the other person had said instead of reacting straight away, and to say things like, I don't disagree with you, but here's what I'm also trying to say, and here's where it's coming from. I don't think that that's the same thing as self-censorship, even though on the surface it can look similar. Self-censorship is when I edit something down to nothing or hold it back entirely out of fear. That pause is something else. It's still saying the true thing. It's just choosing the moment and the framing deliberately so the other person can actually hear it instead of getting defensive. One silences me, and the other one is just good communication, in my opinion. And honestly, learning to tell those two things apart in the moment is still something I'm working on. They can feel identical from the inside, right up until you notice whether anything actually got said. But I do think this is loosening slowly. Some of that has come from unexpected places, which I'll get into properly in a moment. But I want to talk about what actually combats this, because it's not just about understanding where it came from. At some point, you actually have to do something about it. When I was a teenager, with one close friend in particular, I used to dance in the middle of the street to whatever song happened to be playing, or in a store, because we were just on the same wavelength, completely uninhibited, and it felt completely natural. And I have quite a loud laugh, so I used to laugh quite loudly at everything, and like properly loudly, and that was just my natural laugh. And at some point, I can't remember when, I was told my laugh was too much, and it was too annoying and too loud, which I might have mentioned before, but I can't remember. And so somewhere along the way, I stopped having that laugh and even changed it slightly. Not kind of consciously, not like a decision that I sat down and made. I didn't sit there and change my laugh for hours on end practicing it. It was just that I would become very aware of it in the moment and dial it down a bit. So I just quietly edited all those things out because they'd become evidence against me rather than just things I enjoyed doing. So recently I've started deliberately doing them again. For example, when I went to Disneyland, I danced in the middle of the street to whatever was playing, on my own with no one prompting me. And there's something to be said for being around people who bring that out of you naturally. And I have people, and I've had people that did that for me. But there's a different kind of joy in being able to do it without anyone else there at all, because it's not borrowed then from the moment or the company. It's just mine. It's just your thing wholly and fully. And now this is going to sound really random, but the other thing that's helped me is dance-based fitness workouts I started doing at home over the last year, mostly because I wanted to feel more comfortable in how my body moves. And I talked about the start of that journey back in episode 7, self-awareness in the body, though I hadn't connected it to any of this at the time. But looking back, it makes sense that the two would be linked. If self-censorship is about editing yourself before you're seen, then learning how to move my body freely without an audience again and again was its own quiet rehearsal for letting the unedited version exist at all. Now, I'd actually tried a couple of other routes first. There was one adult ballet class a few years ago, but I didn't really enjoy it because I wasn't comfortable doing the movements in front of other people, which is the same reason I've struggled with fitness classes in general, and why I don't like going to the gym, because of the awareness of other people seeing me do something that I don't feel very good at. So when I found this dance fitness app, the whole appeal was that I could do it completely alone in my room with the door shut. No mirrors I hadn't chosen, no one catching me get a move wrong or get frustrated when I couldn't get it right. And that boundary mattered more than I expected it to, because it meant I could fail privately over and over until failing privately stopped feeling like failing at all. The way I've actually done all of this, the dancing in public, the workouts in private, is actually by pushing straight through the discomfort rather than waiting for it to disappear first. Acting as if I'm not embarrassed even when I am, until eventually the embarrassment just doesn't show up as often. Which has actually made me more confident, not less. Because I find that I have more fun now than I did when I was carefully managing how everything looked. But I do want to be clear though, because this isn't a universal prescription. I'm not saying you should force yourself to do things just because someone else seems to enjoy them, especially if it's genuinely not in your nature. It's just that for me, this was in my nature. I just buried it so deep under other people's perceptions that I'd forgotten it was there in the first place. And truthfully, there's a kind of grief in looking back at that. Friendships, relationships, memories, whole stretches of time where I could have been more fully myself and wasn't. And I do wonder sometimes whether those memories would have been even better if I had been. But I also have to give myself grace because I was in the middle of an identity crisis I didn't even know I was having. And all of it, including the years of editing myself down, is part of what got me here, doing this podcast, talking about it in a way that I hope actually helps someone else recognise it in themselves before it costs them as many years as it's cost me. One side effect I didn't expect from all of this, though, is that it has actually quietly given me more confidence to say the unedited thing too. I'm still not all the way there. The performer in my head still doesn't have an audience the way she does inside my own mind. But the gap between her and the version you're hearing right now is much smaller than it used to be. I'm aware that this episode has, once again, had a lot in it with the theory and the specific memories and things that are quite particular to me. You know, you might not have grown up bilingual. You may have never written fan fiction. You might not have a friend you debate with or a bully who ever gave you an answer at all. The details are mine. But I do hope that there is something in the way that it's made me feel, at least feels a bit familiar to you as the listener. I'm hoping that when I share these stories, they resonate with you in a way that you might be able to recognise in your own life. And that, like I said in the first episodes, that this makes you feel a bit less lonely and seen. Because underneath all of it, the actual question is just this. Is there a version of you that only exists when no one's watching? A way you dance or laugh or argue or create if you genuinely believed it couldn't be used against you later? Most people, I think, have some version of that gap between the backstage self and the one that actually gets an audience. Mine just happens to come with some footnotes. So even if none of my specific stories land for you, I would maybe guess that the editing process does. The pause before you speak, the version that gets sent out instead of the one that formed first. I hope that's the bit that you actually sit with more than any of the theory, I guess. But I'd be interested to know if any of it does relate to you and if any of the theory has opened a door in some way. So this episode's uncomfortably honest is this. Even now, the person in my head is more confident than the one you're listening to. She would get up and sing karaoke to a full bar without flinching. She would dance in the middle of a crowd without thinking twice. She'd get on a stage and just talk, no notes, no fear, to an auditorium full of people. And I am trying to step into her more these days, and honestly, when I do, it surprises me how much I enjoy it. But there's still this terror in the moment right before. All the attention being on me right in the moment. And that's self-awareness sucking in its purest form. I can see exactly who I'm capable of being. I just still let the awareness of how it might be perceived hold me back from being her. And it's public speaking specifically that still gets me. More than the dancing ever did and more that singing does now, although I'm still working on that. And I think it's because there's nothing else to hide behind. There's no music, no routine, no group of people around you doing the same thing, no quick succession of movements to lose yourself in. With public speaking, it's just you standing there, expected to be the source of truth in the room, and every word is exposed the second it leaves your mouth. There's nowhere for the edit to happen in real time. You either say it or you don't. So here's what I want to leave you with. Not quite the same question as episode 6, though I know it might sound similar on the surface. This one's just a little bit more specific. What would you have to feel safe from in order to let your performer take the stage, even just once? Not forever, not as a full transformation, just once, fully, without the edit. Don't forget to follow or subscribe to make sure you catch future episodes. It really means a lot. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!